The anniversary had meant something to Daniel. 10 years of laughter, loss, and everything in between. He'd stayed up late for weeks, combing through old photos, handwritten notes, even plane tickets from their first spontaneous trip to Savannah. The scrapbook wasn't just paper and glue, it was a timeline of their love, crafted with care. He wrapped it carefully and left it on the dining table with a small note. For every moment that made us who we are. When Vanessa walked in from work, she glanced at the package like it was an invoice. "What's this?" she asked flatly. "Just open it," he said, a quiet excitement in his voice. She sat down, peeled back the wrapping, flipped through a few pages, and then burst out laughing. "Seriously, Daniel? A scrapbook? Are we in high school?" She shoved it across the table like it was contaminated. "God, you're so emotional." Daniel blinked. "It's our story. I thought it would mean something." She scoffed, standing up. "You always do this, trying to turn everything into some sentimental performance. What I needed was a new phone. Or at least something practical. But no, I get stickers and poems." Daniel's chest tightened, but he swallowed his response. He watched her pace across the kitchen, muttering, "This is exactly what I mean. You live in feelings. I need someone who lives in reality." He nodded slowly, his hands resting on the table beside the discarded book. Reality. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, like the seconds before a storm. Vanessa didn't even notice the look in Daniel's eyes. The moment was already changing him. He'd poured his heart into a memory, and she'd labeled it trash. Something inside him began to shift, and it wasn't going back. Vanessa didn't ease into it. She dropped the truth like it was an overdue chore. "I'm leaving you, Daniel," she said, arms crossed like a prosecutor, not a partner. "I've been seeing someone else. His name's Levi. He's 23, spontaneous, and he actually makes me feel alive." Daniel sat frozen at the edge of the kitchen counter. The sting from her earlier mockery barely faded. "Now this?" His mind couldn't keep up. "You're serious," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Vanessa didn't blink. "I need more than this small-town loop. More than scrapbooks and teacher paychecks. I want to live, not rot in comfort." She moved around the house, grabbing a suitcase as if this was just another business trip. "Levi's helping me figure things out. I've already sublet a place near his studio in Atlanta. We're doing this." Daniel stood there, heart hammering, trying to process how the woman he once thought was his soulmate had become a stranger with a duffel bag and a checklist. "And you didn't think to talk to me before planning a whole new life?" he asked, voice low. Not out of calm, but out of shock. Vanessa laughed bitterly. "You wouldn't have listened. You're always so busy chasing memories, hoping they'll fix the present. I don't want a scrapbook. I want something real." She brushed past him on her way to the door, not noticing or caring that her words left scorch marks. Daniel said nothing. He just watched. Not because he was weak, but because something inside him had gone completely still. The heartbreak wasn't from her leaving. It was the realization that she'd left him a long time ago. This was just the first time she had the decency to say it out loud. As Vanessa reached for her bag and turned toward the door, Daniel finally spoke. His voice calm, almost amused. "Before you go, you might want to see what was in the back of that useless scrapbook." She paused, half annoyed, half curious, and watched as he walked over to the table, flipped open the back cover, and slid out a crisp folded document. "This," he said, holding it up between two fingers, "is the deed to a lakefront cabin I bought. For us. I was going to surprise you tonight." The silence was immediate. The smug defiance slipped from her face like melting wax. "You bought a house?" she asked, eyes narrowing. Daniel gave a half smile. "Yeah, a place to unwind, to create, to breathe. I did it while you were off chasing Levi's playlists and protein shakes." Vanessa stepped forward, reaching for the paper, but Daniel folded it and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Don't bother. I'll enjoy it alone. Or better yet, I'll make it a retreat for people who value what I bring to the table." Her voice faltered. "You're being petty." "No," he replied, buttoning his jacket slowly. I'm being clear. She didn't say goodbye, just stood there, stunned and unmoored, while Daniel walked out of the house and into the crisp night air. He didn't slam the door. He didn't look back. Because in that moment, the only thing that mattered was the cabin and the peace that came with knowing it was his alone. Daniel drove through the quiet streets of Asheville with the deed tucked safely in his glove box and 1,000 emotions rattling in his chest. He didn't go home. He didn't even think to. Instead, his car practically drove itself to the familiar brick duplex where his best friend Elijah lived above his bakery. The porch light was still on when he knocked. Moments later, Elijah opened the door, eyebrows raised, eyes scanning Daniel's pale face. "Vanessa?" he asked. Daniel nodded wordlessly, and Elijah stepped aside. "Come in. Couch or whiskey first?" Whiskey came first. Daniel collapsed into the couch, gripping the tumbler as if it were a lifeline. "She called the scrapbook sentimental garbage," he said flatly, then told me she's leaving for some guy named Levi. He's 23, plays bass in some underground band. Apparently, he makes her feel alive. Elijah muttered something unrepeatable under his breath. "You want me to punch him or bake him a cake with laxatives in it?" Daniel let out a half laugh, the first real sound of life he'd made in hours. "Neither. She's not worth the energy, but I don't know who I am outside of her. I've been Daniel and Vanessa for so long." Elijah leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Then maybe it's time to find out who just Daniel is. And spoiler alert, you're more than someone's emotional baggage." Daniel looked around the small, warm apartment, the smell of cinnamon and sugar still lingering in the air. Safe, quiet, honest. That night, he slept on Elijah's couch with a blanket over him and the weight of 10 years finally starting to lift. The road ahead was foggy, but for the first time in years, he felt like he might be driving it alone. And that didn't scare him anymore. By morning, Daniel's phone was a battlefield of buzzing notifications. 6 missed calls, 10 texts, and a voicemail labeled urgent, all from Vanessa. He stared at the screen as he sipped coffee Elijah had brewed strong enough to jolt a ghost awake. The messages ran the full spectrum: guilt, confusion, manipulation. "We need to talk. You can't just walk away like this." One message even tried nostalgia. "Don't throw away 10 years over one mistake." Daniel nearly laughed. The only one throwing things away had been her. Elijah peered over the rim of his coffee mug. "Let me guess. Now that Levi's got commitment breath, she's panicking?" Daniel didn't reply. He just opened one last text. "I'm going to swing by the lake house later. We need closure." His lips pressed into a tight line. My lake house, he thought. Shadillicated like it was hers to return to, like he was the one who had to adjust. That was the moment Daniel made 2 decisions. He wouldn't respond, and he wouldn't be unprepared. By noon, he'd called a local locksmith and changed the locks at the cabin. By evening, he had met with a lawyer who was more than happy to represent him. "You've got solid ground," the attorney told him. "You're the buyer, the sole name on the deed, and she walked out. That gives you more leverage than you think." Daniel nodded. For the first time since Vanessa's announcement, he felt less like a man reacting and more like one reclaiming. The silence between them didn't rattle him anymore. It was strategic. He wasn't avoiding conflict. He was giving her just enough time to realize that this time she wasn't in control of the ending. He was. And the sound of gravel crunching under tires made Daniel look up from his sketchpad. He was sitting on the porch of the cabin, wrapped in a flannel shirt, a mug of tea cooling beside him. A familiar silver SUV rolled into the driveway. Vanessa, of course. No warning, just like always. She stepped out in designer boots, sunglasses perched in her hair, and a face that tried to fake composure but failed. "You've been ignoring me," she called out, like this was a high school spat. Daniel stayed seated. "I have. Thought the silence might help you reflect." She walked up the steps, arms crossed tightly. "Look, things with Levi. They didn't work out. He's immature, unpredictable. Like skydiving in human form," Daniel said flatly. not rising to greet her. Her eyes narrowed. "You're not being fair." He let out a short laugh. "Fair? You humiliated me, trashed what I made for us, and walked out with a guy who probably thinks Roth IRAs are a music genre. And now you're here because your backup plan fizzled out." "I made a mistake," she said softly. "But we can fix this. We've been through so much." Daniel stood slowly, leveling his gaze at her. "No, Vanessa. I've been through so much. You just bailed when things got ordinary. And the part you never understood is, ordinary is sacred. It's where love grows." She blinked, stunned. "You really mean that?" "I do," he said, opening the cabin door, not to invite her in, but to step back inside alone. "And that's why you can't stay. Not in my house, not in my life, not anymore." The screen door shut behind him, muffling the sound of her voice, and for the first time, he didn't feel like he had anything left to explain. The morning after Vanessa's visit, Daniel woke up to silence. The good kind. No texts, no tension, no expectations pressing down on his chest. Just the rustling of pine trees and the soft lapping of water against the dock. He stepped outside with a mug of fresh coffee, breathing in the scent of dew-soaked earth and pine needles. The air felt cleaner here. Freer, like every inhale was scrubbing years of resentment from his lungs. Inside the cabin, he hung new curtains, rearranged furniture, and started reclaiming the space. Not as a getaway for two, but as a sanctuary for one. In the afternoons, he wandered the wooded trails behind the cabin with his sketch pad in hand, stopping to capture moments. Sunlight filtering through leaves, the ripples on the lake, birds mid-flight. He hadn't drawn like this in years. The pressure to be someone's rock, to always perform, had buried his creative instincts. Now, with no one watching, he was free to rediscover them. Evenings became rituals of solitude. A fire crackling in the stone hearth, vinyl records spinning low, and handwritten journal pages filling up with thoughts he'd never had room to write before. There were no deadlines, no eggshells to walk on, no more trying to be enough. The peace wasn't loud or triumphant. It was slow and steady, like water smoothing jagged stones. And in that stillness, Daniel realized something powerful. He wasn't just healing. He was starting over. On his terms. In his time. In the pines. With every sunrise over Lake Lure, Daniel felt a new layer of his old life fall away. But peace alone wasn't enough. He craved purpose. One afternoon, while flipping through his sketchbook, he remembered a conversation he'd had with a student years ago. How art had helped them cope with their parents' divorce. The memory struck like lightning. That evening, he stayed up sketching not landscapes, but logos. By morning, the idea had a name. Ash and Ember Studio. A place for healing, not just for him, but for anyone carrying grief, shame, or heartbreak too heavy to name. He transformed the cabin's sunroom into a studio space. Easels by the windows, shelves stacked with paints and charcoals, tables scarred with life and use. He put out a call on social media and to the local community. A free weekly workshop in expressive art, open to all. The first week, only 2 people came. By the third, there were 12. Teens, veterans, burned-out parents, all sitting together in quiet creation, their pain finding shape in... Daniel didn't preach. He didn't position himself as a guru. He simply guided, listened, and let the art do the work. And in that, he found his calling. The man who once begged for his wife's validation now stood at the head of a circle of strangers, each one rediscovering themselves in the mess of color and form. Ash and Ember wasn't just a studio. It was a symbol. Of destruction, yes, but also of rebirth. A space born from betrayal, now lit with the fire of transformation. And every time someone left a little lighter than they came in, Daniel knew he hadn't lost everything. He'd traded comfort for calling, and it was the best trade he'd ever made. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, ordinary as any other. Daniel was sorting through donated brushes in the studio when his phone buzzed with a name he hadn't seen in weeks, Vanessa. He stared at the screen, thumb hovering, The preview alone was enough to know what it was. "I've been thinking a lot. Levi's gone. I messed up. Can we talk?" He opened it, more out of curiosity than emotion. The message unfolded into a wall of regret. How Levi had ghosted her, how work had become unbearable, how she missed the realness of what they had. She asked to meet for coffee. "Closure," she said. Daniel sat back, letting the phone rest on his desk. He didn't feel the rage he used to. No stab of hurt or bitterness. Just a strange sense of distance, like reading a story that no longer belonged to him. He imagined the old version of himself, eager, hopeful, desperate for her to see his worth, rushing to reply. That man was gone. He picked up the phone, hovered for a second, and then hit delete. No response, no explanation, just silence. Because some doors don't need to be slammed, they just need to stay closed. Outside, a student called his name. Daniel stood, tucked his phone in his pocket, and walked back into the studio with a quiet smile. He didn't need her apology. He didn't even need her closure. What he had now was better. A life that no longer made room for people who only valued him too late. When the email arrived with the subject line, Keynote Invitation Carolina Wellness Summit, Daniel nearly deleted it, assuming it was spam. But it was real. A community mental health organization had heard about Ash and Ember Studio and wanted him to share his story. How he turned heartbreak into healing. At first, his stomach twisted with doubt. Vanessa's voice echoed in his memory, mocking his public speaking, his fumbling words. But then he remembered the faces in his studio. Smiling, trusting, rebuilding. They didn't need perfect, they needed honest. The night before the event, Elijah called. "Just speak from the ashes, man," he said. "You lit your own damn fire, now let 'em feel the heat." Standing backstage at the rustic event hall, Daniel felt his palms sweat. But the moment he stepped onto the stage and saw rows of expectant, kind faces, the nerves gave way to clarity. "A year ago, my life fell apart," he began. "But what I thought was the end was actually the start of everything that matters." He told them about the scrapbook, the betrayal, the cabin, and the studio. He didn't gloss over the pain. He made space for it, just like he did in Ash and Ember. By the time he finished, the room was silent, then erupted in applause. People lined up afterward to hug him, thank him, share their stories. And in that moment, under warm lights and with his voice echoing across the room, Daniel finally knew. His story wasn't just his anymore. It was a spark for others. That evening, Daniel returned to the cabin, the keynote badge still tucked in his coat pocket like a strange little trophy. He lit a fire in the stone pit just outside the porch, wrapped himself in a wool blanket, and sat under a sky full of stars. The lake shimmered quietly beyond the trees, reflecting a life that had shifted in every possible way. He took out his journal, the same one he'd used since the day Vanessa left. Rage, grief, disbelief, numbness. The emotions had bled onto the paper in jagged ink. But now, there was space. Space between the pain and the person he had become. He thought about the version of himself who had once believed love meant self-erasure, shrinking down to fit someone else's shape. He had bent so far for Vanessa, twisted himself into someone softer, smaller, safer. And still, it hadn't been enough. But maybe that was the point. Some people won't love you no matter how much of yourself you sacrifice. And that's not your failure. It's theirs. Daniel looked into the fire, its orange glow flickering against his face. "Thank you," he whispered, not to her, but to the man he used to be, the one who kept trying, the one who learned the hard way. From the ashes of his marriage, he had built a life full of color, courage, and clarity. He didn't just survive the betrayal, he transformed because of it. And as the fire crackled and the stars watched quietly overhead, Daniel felt something that had once seemed impossible. Peace, not in spite of the past, but because of it. Sometimes the most painful endings are the ones that push us toward the most meaningful beginnings. Daniel had poured his heart into a marriage where effort went unnoticed and love became conditional. He thought loyalty meant staying, even when it losing pieces of himself. But when the person he trusted most discarded not only his gift, but his heart, Daniel was forced to look inward, and what he found was a quiet strength that had been there all along, waiting to rise. The betrayal wasn't just about infidelity or insults. It was about erasure, being made to feel invisible, small, replaceable. But instead of letting that narrative define him, Daniel rewrote it. He turned solitude into sanctuary and pain into purpose. He stopped trying to be enough for someone who had already made up their mind, and chose, instead, to be whole for himself. What he learned was this: healing doesn't come from closure with the one who hurt you. It comes from giving yourself permission to walk away, to rebuild, and to thrive. The very act of reclaiming your life on your own terms is the most powerful revenge and the truest form of peace. Daniel's story is a reminder that the people who leave may never return the love they took, but that doesn't mean you're empty. Sometimes what they leave behind is the space you needed to finally become who you were always meant to be. And that's a gift no one can take away. The lesson Daniel learned was simple, yet life-changing. Losing someone who never truly valued you is not a loss. It's liberation. For years, he tried to measure up to Vanessa's shifting standards, mistaking sacrifice for love. But when she mocked his gift and left for someone younger, Daniel finally saw the truth. He was never the problem. He had been giving his heart to someone who only ever saw its weight, not its worth. Through solitude and self-reflection, he rediscovered his passion, rebuilt his identity, and created a life rooted in purpose, not performance. Vanessa's betrayal didn't break him. It freed him. It forced him to stop waiting for permission to be seen and to start choosing himself, unapologetically. Daniel's journey reminds us that heartbreak isn't the end. It's often the beginning of becoming. The people who walk away may believe they're leaving us behind, but in truth, they're making space for us to evolve. And when we stop chasing approval from those who undervalue us, we finally become the version of ourselves we were meant to be, stronger, freer, and fully alive. That is the quiet triumph of letting go.